This is Counterpoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. Today, we turn to two questions that are increasingly and quietly urgent. What kind of education does a liberal democracy require? And what happens when it loses that kind of education? Once, Canadian universities saw liberal education, which is engagement with history, philosophy, literature, civic tradition, not merely as an ornament, but as essential to forming citizens capable of understanding justice, participating in debate, and living under a constitution. But today, that sense is fading. Education is more and more evaluated for its utility, whether it leads to jobs, whether it builds economic competitiveness, rather than whether it forms character. In the Crisis in Liberal Education and Liberal Democracy Review, we see that this decline is more than academic. Fewer students are drawn to humanities and social sciences unless they see a direct career path. The very idea of studying Plato, Shakespeare, Tocqueville as an ends in themselves seems very antiquated. Yet observers warn that democracy without citizens who have reflected on virtue, the good, the limits of power, is a democracy unarmed. So these shifts are raising troubling corollaries. If our education fails to challenge relativism, if students are trained to consume rather than critique, if civic education becomes a thin shell around technical skills, then what will anchor our democratic culture? What becomes of responsible government, of equal liberty, if citizens no longer see the foundational principles of Canada as something to learn, live, or debate? What happens to democratic moderation, to public virtue, when education becomes simply a means to a vocational ends or cultural affirmation? Well, joining us to explore all of this is David W. Livingstone, professor and chair of liberal studies at Vancouver Island University. He also edited this collection of essays found in his book, Liberal Education, Civic Education and the Canadian Regime, Past Principles and Present Challenges. Dr. Livingstone, thank you so much for joining me today. This is a very interesting topic, and as a mother of five and an educator, for me, this really speaks to my heart. So let's start with kind of the core concern of your book. You argue that Canada's regime, if you will, once supported a tradition of liberal education aimed at forming civil character and virtue and moral responsibility. How and when have you observed this tradition erode?
Yeah, thanks for having me, by the way. Hard to say that I have a date where you could pinpoint where it begins to change, but I think probably about, the 1960s, you start to see a real shift, particularly in the universities. But you might go back even further than that. There's a famous, well, should be famous author, Canadian author, Hilda Neatby, wrote a fabulous book called So Little for the Mind. Yeah, I think that came out about 1953. She was talking mostly about the K through 12 system, but she was already ringing the alarm bell that changes were occurring there that she thought were not going to be good for our democratic health. Sort of the progressive education system of John Dewey was coming up from the United States into our system here. And she was quite adamant that that was not going to be helpful for forming the kinds of citizens that you just described in the opening there, capable of sort of knowing our political traditions, knowing sort of the virtues or having the virtues to actually be self-governing individuals. She very much worried that they were just going to be more or less brainwashed with a certain, social view coming from John Dewey and from the progressives. And unfortunately, I think that's largely come true. And the universities are playing their role as well. So it's not good. And I would say probably about the 1950s, 1960s, we really start to see some things changing.
Now, for some of our viewers, they may not be as familiar with the term liberal education. What is meant by
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, there's sort of a watered down version that's out there now, and you probably talk to even in university administrators, and they'll say, "Well, what we mean by the liberal arts or liberal education is just sort of do a sampling of courses in all kinds of areas. A little bit of this, a little bit of that." Um, that's not really a very adequate definition anymore, because it's not as though everything that a student takes is really contributing to what we would consider a genuine liberal education.
Hmm.
They could be doing computer science, which may be important for its own reasons, but it's not really part of the traditional understanding of liberal education. So, what is liberal education? Well, largely it's looking at some of the big questions that human beings have asked for a long, long time, for
Okay, I'm going to pause you
centuries.
there because I know this is going to be
Yep.
a very fulsome segment. We're going to pick it up right when we come back from this commercial break.